I was wondering when I said heading to church. Well, I first said heating, then I said heading. And if not, Zoom info same as last week. And I misspelled as at.
That's
spelled
okay.
wonderfully.
I was going to say
Well,
over 2.
we will go ahead and get started. So this is do what?
And they will join when they do.
Yes.
Right.
And hopefully, let me make sure. I got too many things plugged in, so.
Well, I'm glad you guys are feeling better.
Yes, we do. We have RSV.
Alright.
Really
That is on.
Sorry.
This is on.
It's okay.
Okay.
Survived.
Suppose we're immune now.
So this week we're going to continue with Who Are Friends, which is a continuation from week 1. So where did we leave off? Does anybody remember? So long ago.
She has notes.
Yes.
He's good. I'm a star student.
Cool.
Abby's my favorite, just so you know.
And she'll take a note of that.
Okay, I have like a bunch of random quotes, but we were talking about silence. We were talking about it being like communion for us is holy silence and
Okay. So it was after 1652 with Fox's vision on Pendle Hills where we kind of ended, and that's when Eric's here. Or Obi's here, I should say. So the summary of what that vision is he saw an ocean of darkness and death, and an infinite ocean of light was flowing into it and taking over it. So what happens next? If you got a vision like that, how would you respond? Can you hear us okay, Eric?
That's enough.
Eric, can you hear us?
We're going to get another audio. All right, yeah, I can hear you guys.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. I was hoping, because this is very important. How would you feel if you got a vision of an ocean of darkness and death, and then seeing light come in and just overtaking it?
I'd like to think inspired.
It'd be something that would probably inspire me anyway. So, and that's when he started the church. He is excited, and so are those around him. And basically from 1652 on is when the Friends movement really took hold. Fox wasn't the only one that was a preacher at that time. There's a group called the Valiant 60. Each of them is worth like at least a month's study solid, if not an entire year, because they're all very cool. We're going to go through, not all 60, my
There will be 2
favorites.
points for each correct answer at the
We'll
quiz.
go through my favorites and in a very quick manner. So,
Just imagine like a Quaker Western movie with the Valiant 60.
so
Well,
it would
that's,
be
that's not the
it would be pretty
persuasion
cool.
movie, but
So
that's
here's a
close.
list of the Valiant 60 that you can get from Wikipedia, which I
Eric's
use
covering
that
up 4 names.
amazingly scholarly website to do a lot of my research. The ones that Eric's covering up, they don't have links anyway, so if you want to see them all, just look up Valiant 60 Quaker and you'll find that list on Wikipedia. So notice there's men and women. So that's very important to early Friends. So they're all ordinary people. They weren't high class scholarly people necessarily. Very few of them were considered educated. So couple weeks ago I mentioned Barclay's apology. Barclay wasn't one of the Valiant 60. He wasn't one of the original, what they call first generation Quaker ministers. He was the next round of converts, as was William Penn. So the early ones weren't considered educated. A lot of them were considered illiterate. Even George Fox, who had the entire Bible basically memorized, was considered illiterate because he didn't go to a university somewhere. So they weren't stupid by any means. They just weren't educated to that degree. There was men, women, and teenagers. So some of them started ministering at 14.
Wow.
And there were elderly people as well. Farmers and tradesmen, early friends, most of them weren't allowed to even go to school. So they couldn't become lawyers or study theology or something like that. They were barred from university. So they took up a lot of trades and they opened businesses. So a lot of industry in England and the United Kingdom at that time were led by Friends. They were very big in the railroad industry, both in England and here. And some of the boiler makers in England were Quakers. And chocolate was also a big thing. Cadbury is a Quaker.
Banking.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Cadbury, yeah, he was an early Quaker.
Wasn't Hires
Why-
also? The
Yeah,
creator of
Hires
Hires root beer?
Hires root beer was also Quaker.
So cool.
Why were they barred from school?
It's the way the school system works over there.
If you weren't a member of the church, then you
If
couldn't
you
go to
if
school.
you weren't in good standing with the Church of England, you couldn't go to school. Catholics, both in mostly northern England, parts of Scotland and Ireland, kids couldn't go to school. In all those locations, they had what were known as hedge schools. Quite often, it was a priest who was trying to be incognito to avoid getting burned at the stake or hung or kicked out of the country at the very least.
Makes sense.
Would gather like in farmstead groves of trees and hold school while some of the older kids who had already been in school for a while stood lookout, or adults, their parents would stand lookout if they could take the time off. It's just the way the system was there. And that lasted in the 1970s, even into the early 80s. If you wanted to go where I did my graduate work at Trinity, you had to be a Church of England. If you were Catholic, starting in the 50s, you could get a special permission to go to Trinity, that your bishop, Catholic bishop, had to sign off saying it was okay for you to go to school, and Trinity had to decide to let you in at the same time.
Sounds like an environment that homeschooling would have started taking root.
It's changed a lot since then. There's a lot of other stuff like that left over, particularly in England.
But it took till really
Around our lifetime.
our lifetime, basically, or our parents' lifetime.
Even today, the schools there are a few national schools which are non-denominational. There are Church of Ireland schools, there are Catholic schools, there's 2 or 3 Quaker schools in Dublin. So there's still a lot of association with the various religious groups running the schools there. You see an old national school in particular, there's a door at each end of the building, and one is the girls' entrance and one is the boys' entrance. The school Bridget went to was an all-girls school. There are not a lot of mixed schools. I'd say in Dublin, which is about the size of, it's a little smaller than Kansas City, Missouri. There were maybe a dozen mixed schools.
Wow.
And only one or two that were like totally independent.
Wow.
It's still very odd. You can tell which school a kid went to if you don't want to ask directly. Just ask them what sports they played.
Of course.
If they played hurling and Gaelic football or soccer, they went to Catholic schools. If they played rugby and soccer and field hockey, they went to a Protestant school.
Interesting. Oh my God.
That is really interesting.
There's
So-
a lot of anachronisms left until 1974. If you worked you're a woman who worked for the Irish government and you got married, you had to resign.
Right.
It's hard to believe that this is within recent history.
Yes.
So it's that's the reason for it.
Key members of the Valiant 60, Margaret Fell is considered the mother of Quakerism. She was married to Judge Fell and was the lady of Swarthmore Hall. So if you see anything Swarthmore, it's usually Quaker related.
Oh.
There's a school back east.
Yeah.
You can still visit Swarthmore Hall.
And if there's a Pendle Hill, anything, it's usually started Quaker as well. Judge Fell never became a Quaker. He was a judge, so he had to deal with a lot of Quakers. But his wife and his daughters all joined, but his son didn't, which is kind of interesting. Probably because he wanted to go to school. So, but Judge Fell allowed Margaret, his wife, to hold Quaker meetings in the house. Which, as a judge that's persecuting Quakers, that's really quite interesting. And Swarthmore Hall kind of became the center of Quaker activity. So we have a yearly meeting office in Wichita. That's basically what Swarthmore was in early Quakerdom. So
If you visit Swarthmore, they will show you the room that meetings were held in. And then there's this little antechamber off of it that only has one chair in it. And that was the judge's office. And he would not attend the meeting,
But
but he would sit at his desk with the door open.
Oh.
He wasn't in the same room.
he wasn't a Quaker, but he was a Quaker. Right?
plausible deniability, I guess.
Right.
Yes.
So in 1664, Margaret was arrested for failing to take an oath of allegiance and for allowing Quaker meetings to be held in her home. This was after Judge Fell died. So prior to that, she worked a lot, used her position as a noble lady and as a wife of the judge to try to get Quakers out of jail. So they were very happy to be able to finally arrest her. And she spent a lot of time in jail. She wrote almost exclusively about equality of peoples and justifying ministry or women in ministry, which is important to early Quakers. We were one of the first groups that traditionally, for all of our history, allowed women to be ministers. And she actually married George Fox in 1669 And
Yeah.
they spent most of their marriage in jail. So
Aw.
they very rarely saw each other. They just wrote letters, and he is either traveling, or she was traveling, or they were in jail. So it was kind of interesting. I don't even know why they got married, but it was convenient, I guess. The next one that I kind of want to mention is George Whitehead. He was convinced at age 14, and he entered ministry at age 16. And then at age 18, he was sent to jail. So,
Wow.
and he was sent to jail because he is charged with blasphemy because he expressed his opinion about baptism. And then he remained in jail for quite some time because he wouldn't take his hat off for the judge. When you read through a lot of this, it's like, man, the Brits were very petty. So,
Yeah. Remove your hat, sir. No.
I mean, today we
Nay.
can be held in contempt for a lot of stuff like that,
absolutely.
but it's interesting that so many, I mean, I can understand the blasphemy stuff, but so many of them, they wouldn't take an oath, or they wouldn't take their hat off. They wouldn't call somebody or they'd say the instead of you. So
And that would
to a
actually
noble
come.
person. So it's just a lot of what we're experiencing right now with the pronoun debates is what they experienced back then. So, and it's
For different reasons.
for different reasons, but it's very similar. And if we think it's petty, then maybe we should think about how we're reacting to certain things today. So his main focus in ministry was religious freedom. And the reason I mention him is after his initial 10 years in ministry, about 1672, he got married and stopped traveling. But he was a grocer in London, and he spent most of his time speaking to members of parliament about religious tolerance. So, and again, he couldn't be a lawyer himself, but he was very instrumental in the Bill of Rights Act. I can't seem to work my thing. Bill of Rights Act in 89 or something like that.
Yeah.
1689.
Yeah. So Ann Cam, newbie Odlin, the reason I include her is you can actually find newbies in Wichita.
Ooh.
So
That's cool.
from the very beginning,
Oh,
went to church with a newbie.
must not have played video games.
Her and her husband John Aldwin were convinced in 1652. You notice something? 1652 comes up a lot. That's after that vision. And they both became traveling ministers. And the reason I include her, she is jailed for blasphemy in 1653, mainly because she is speaking to a priest. And while she was in prison, she authored a book called A True Declaration of Suffering of the Innocents, which spoke against false accusations and how people were treated in the justice system of England. So, do you notice a little bit of a trend here? I didn't include Elizabeth Fry, but she was instrumental in prison reform. To this day, she's one of the biggest prison reform activists that changed how people are incarcerated.
Wait, who's that?
Elizabeth Fry. So, towards the end, or before John passed away, she stopped traveling with him because she didn't want pregnancy to get in the way of her ministry, which I just found was funny.
Fair.
So, and she did have a child with John, and he died before it was born. And she got married again to Cam in like 2 weeks after John's death. So, which sounds really soon, but in that time frame, and Quakers would often have relationships with others based on what was good for the community, not necessarily true love and all that. So, which is probably why Margaret Fell and George Fox also got married. It was good for the meetings. James Naylor, or Nayer, I always say Nayer, but there's an L in there. He's probably the most controversial of all the Valiant 60. And the reason is because he is incredibly charismatic. And he had a following probably greater than George Fox's. But he was imprisoned for blasphemy for reenacting the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday in Bristol. He rode into Bristol on a horse, and he was arrested for
Was
it.
that the one that they put a hole in his tongue? Or was that a
Yeah,
different
he
guy?
had his tongue. They stuck a pole through a red hot iron through his tongue, and branded a B on his forehead.
Wow.
I thought he was like saying they were saying that he was the second coming.
Yeah, he.
His followers.
Oh.
Some
So most
people did
that's why he
believe
was
that he was the
Yeah.
prophet or the second coming.
I didn't realize he was considered one of the Valiant 60.
Yeah, he
I
was.
heard about
he
him.
was very important, actually, and I'm glad you brought that up, Eric, because
What did Eric say?
George Fox actually called him out on his ministry. So they actually had arguments and clashes, but he didn't ever tell James to stop ministry. He just advised him against how he was doing things. And he argued with him because he was attracting attention to himself, taking on this idea that he's a prophet or a messianic figure. And George said that's not simple living, that's not being true to the light, because there's only one true light, and you're not it.
Yeah, they were not nice to him. That was only one of the things they did to him. They did a lot of other things to him as
They were
punishment.
nice to lots of Quakers.
Oh, I know. I'm just that one in particular had some pretty bad things happen to him.
They weren't nice to many people, but
Right.
after he was arrested, he spent a long time in prison. I guess if you say you're Jesus,
Then
you're arrested for a while, or let people say that you're Jesus. After he got out of prison, though, he did go directly to George Fox, and he went and knelt before him and begged for his for George's forgiveness for not taking his advice. And they did reconcile, and they both continued to minister, even though he had a hole in his tongue and a B branded on his forehead. So I don't know if he's one of them that would walk through town naked or not.
Yeah, some of them did.
Yeah, it was a common thing back then that they would walk through town naked.
Some would kick in doors and argue with pastors mid-sermon.
All right, Elizabeth Houghton. Elizabeth is a common name at that time because it's Elizabethan England. And so she was actually the first female minister. And that's pretty important.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband left her because of her ministry. So she was abandoned by her husband, and he took all the kids, which was, she continued to minister even after that. She was imprisoned for reproving a priest in 1652, so she's actually before George Fox's vision. And in 1660, she was actually beat up by a priest or a minister, which is kind of fun. It shows how deep this resentment went, that a pastor would actually...
She was one of the examples of how it became common practice to beat a Quaker or two in a day.
Yeah. In 1662, she came to the colonies and was in Massachusetts, and basically immediately she was whipped, and they took her out into the forest and left her for dead until she found her way back to Rhode Island. And she made it back to England and then took a trip with George Fox to Jamaica and died in Jamaica in 1672. And she's buried in Jamaica. Jamaica and Barbados were big ministry points of Quakers early on.
Yeah, the Plymouth and Bay colonies were not great places. And you have 1660s, right around there, multiple instances of Quakers being hung on Boston Common for being Quakers.
And everybody likes to say that religious freedom came from the Baptists. Actually, Mary Dyer was hung in Boston Common. She is the first female executed for being a Quaker in Boston, and her husband was actually the governor of Rhode Island, which was kind of cool. But they tried to hang her once before, but because she was a lady, she didn't get hung. And her hanging also changed the mind of the king and encouraged the Tolerance Act, because we can't be hanging women for religious beliefs, was his thought. So Mary Fisher, though, I'm going through pretty quick, and I'm sorry about that, but they're all really cool. She's the missionary. She went all over the place. She was jailed with Elizabeth Houghton in 1652, and she co-authored a pamphlet that was her and Elizabeth wrote, called False Prophets and False Teachers Described. So they wrote a lot, they spent a lot of time in jail, yet they're considered uneducated. So it's kind of interesting. Her and Anne Austen became the first Quakers to minister in the colonies. She also went to Massachusetts and was immediately arrested and tried as a witch.
Yeah.
Because Quakers say that the Spirit leads them, and they hear the voice of God and stuff like that. So I understand why they might think that they were witches, but she just got off the boat. How could they possibly have determined that she was a witch in that amount of time?
That would be the natural LSD in some of the things, in some of the crops they were doing that time.
I've heard that too.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mary Fisher also traveled to the Ottoman Empire and had an audience with the Sultan.
Whoa.
And they tried to not allow her to. They actually put her on a boat to take her somewhere else, and she realized that they were going the wrong direction, so she got off in Greece and made her own way to talk to the Sultan.
Are there books about this person?
Yes.
Okay.
She
Just
survived a witch trial, though.
I
if
think
you're gonna
we
do that,
actually
then you
might
might
have
as well
some in
be
here.
amazing.
She was heavier than a duck, apparently.
So, like I said, all of these people, all 60 of them, are worthy of, at least a semester's worth of study. I mean, you could write master's thesis on any of them. So this ocean
There you
of light.
Hey, Darren.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is
Do you know if she kind of inspired The Witch of Blackbird Pond?
I
The
don't
book.
know if she did.
Okay.
There's a lot of witches, so a lot of people tried as witches. Many Quakers were involved with that too because they're just odd. But I don't know if specifically it was because I'm not really familiar with that story. So
Gotcha.
I'm gonna look that up.
So by 1660 or 89, that's when they passed the Tolerance Act, and so that's 52 to 89. Not that much time. They went from 60 to 60,000 in England. That's not including colonies and all of that. I might have. That's when the Bill of Rights was made. Tolerance Act, I think, was sooner. I wrote this PowerPoint this morning.
It's good.
So, and they traveled throughout Europe, not just to Netherlands was a big place because it was close, and all the way down into Turkey. So all throughout England they traveled, and they traveled to the Caribbean, which I think I misspelled, and the American colonies. Yeah.
Yeah, the Act of Tolerance, I just checked to make sure that I got this right. It allowed the dissenters, Quakers were dissenters,
Mm-hmm.
Presbyterians were dissenters, Methodists were dissenters, Baptists were dissenters, and a whole bunch of others that don't exist anymore or have been absorbed. But the Act of Tolerance did not cover Catholics, it covered only Protestant.
Ooh.
Point to notice. Yeah.
Oh. Okay.
Even into the Napoleonic Wars, it was very difficult to get anywhere in England if you were Catholic. There were so many jobs that you could not have. Most well-educated Catholics went to France or someplace on the continent to go to college.
And Robert Barclay, because he was a Quaker, had to go to France to school as well.
Yeah, even a lot of the dissenting groups were not accepted by the
And that's why the Puritans, the Pilgrims that we had come here, were in the Netherlands before they came to the United States as well.
Well, I bet you Mennonites were
There's-
also.
well, there's
Not in England. I don't even have any of them.
Mennonites have never had a strong presence in England, but you gotta remember there's the Pilgrims and the Puritans, two different colonies, two entirely different thought processes.
That often get mistaken for each other.
The Pilgrims of Plymouth Bay were more in line with the Presbyterian, that sort of part of it. The Puritans were an extreme sect who were trying to suppress any remnants of structure other than their own.
Yeah.
They wanted religious freedom for themselves, not.
Yeah, people talk the Plymouth Bay or the Massachusetts Bay Colony was in no way a tolerant place. Even to, people get the two confused. They are in a similar location, but they are a fair amount apart. What we hear as our Thanksgiving story is Plymouth Colony, who for most of its existence had a very, at least tolerant, occasionally flared up, people got their feelings hurt with the indigenous people in that area. Massachusetts was constantly at war with the
Yes.
people around them where they were trying to go.
Which was why Scottish people went up there, because they were very well employed as fighting people to fight the Indians. Which is why Scottish people and Quakers did not get along a lot during early America.
That's why Delaware became a place.
There's a very large meeting house just off the Miracle Mile in
The Scottish were coming
Edinburgh.
straight off of the
Been
Battle of
to
Bannock.
So how were these early friends organized? So none of those 60 were considered, any of them, to be the sole leader of the movement. And you might say, well, we say George Fox is the leader of the movement. Even he says he didn't attract he tried to not to attract attention to himself, but he pointed to Christ. So he's like, I'm not the leader, God's the leader, Christ is the leader, I'm just doing what I'm called to do. That's why he got upset with Naylor, because he was trying to, he is attracting too much attention to himself instead of pointing it to Christ. So even that argument, though, he distanced himself from him. It didn't say that he was necessarily doing things right, but he didn't totally push him out.
He has nothing to do with it.
He tried to keep the conversation open. So, with all these strong personalities, how do you get anything done? Because they were all extremely strong personalities. In fact, I would not like any of them in our church. To be completely honest, I would like them over there, not here. So
the old saying, how long does it take a Quaker meeting to make a decision?
So you really
It's on
can't
par with
do
an act of
anything
Congress.
in Quaker meetings unless you're willing to submit to each other and to God. So, because everybody has a strong personality, we all have our opinions. If you're not willing to submit to each other and to God, nothing gets done. And all these strong personalities found a way to do that, which that is the miracle in itself, that they actually came out with an actual society of a religious society of friends. It was that it survived beyond that first generation. So what they did is they formed meetings for business around to get clearness for various ministry activities. One of them, because there's so many people in jail, they had meetings for the suffering, where they figure out what the needs were for those in jail and what they could do to help. And a lot of ministry happened in that. Primarily, these were women leading these meetings, because men were too busy doing other things, I guess. And contrary to what a lot of people believe, with that many traveling ministers going all over the world, they also met together to determine how they could assist in releasing people for ministry. Mary Fisher she was supported by the Friends in England to do her missionary work. She did work on her own and earned her own money, but she also had funds to help her. So when people say, oh, Friends have never had paid ministers, even the Valiant 60 had help with their ministry. A lot of them paid for it themselves, but there was assistance. So a Quaker meeting for business, or a meeting for worship in which business is conducted. Gotta love these great names.
I thought you guys just came up with meeting for business. It's just a convenient name. So it turns out.
No, that's the shortened version.
Meeting for worship in which business is conducted.
So, they couldn't. You didn't vote in a meeting for business. You found a sense of the meeting through discussion and meeting in silence. And a lot of times you didn't come to a conclusion until the next month or a year or 2 or 3 years
Some
later.
things are still ongoing.
And we still use this basic form today. Try to. Like I said, in a Quaker meeting, nothing gets done unless we submit to each other and to God. And that's got to be your mindset, or the meeting's dysfunctional.
If I'm leading the meeting for business, for example, and there are everybody in the meeting. We've had this here in the past, so it's not unusual. But you have 1 or 2 people who are steadfastly against it. We simply can't decide. The only way that it can move forward is for whoever is against it to eventually reach a point where they realize that they are stopping the meeting from doing something that needs to be done. And while they might not agree with our exact course of action, they won't oppose our action.
So we call that what? Standing aside?
Yeah.
Yeah, basically you stand aside, or you tell the meeting that, I don't agree with this, but I won't obstruct it. And we've had things that have come up here that have taken much longer than they needed to happen. Most things happen relatively quickly in a meeting for business. When I first started as clerk, we we had what were a council of elders who would have a meeting. The thing of it is that we aren't all that big, so the same 8 people that were at the council of elders, or 6
We're
people
in the business meeting.
were in the business meeting, and then even today, if you look at our stewards, it's Jared, it's me, it's Christy, it's John Marcus, and
I'm on a few of those too now.
and Sherry most of the time. But all we do is we come up with a plan, and then we present it to the meeting, and they go, "That's a good plan," or they tweak it.
Or we go, no, that's a terrible idea.
And
That's a lot less often.
so it's we, instead of having these meetings where because my predecessor liked to decide everything in the meeting of elders, and then simply tell people, "This is what we're going to do."
I'm sure that went well.
Yeah.
You've been clerk twice, right? Because
He took a vacation.
I
when
took
he
a
was-
vacation
and
when
my
we were
mom
in
was in
Ireland.
between those. So
Yeah, your mom
It's
was
hard
the
to be a
assistant
clerk
clerk
when
when I
you're in
left for
Ireland.
Ireland.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Then
I was
when I
just
came
making
back,
sure I was getting my timelines right.
Yeah.
So, how we came up with this
Not my mom.
monthly meeting, it eventually became known as monthly meeting instead of meeting for the suffering or meeting for the traveling ministers. In the Church of England, in England, there could only be one church, and that was the Church of England. So you couldn't call it a church. It was a religious society of friends. You couldn't call the building the church, even though they wouldn't have called it a church anyway, because their belief is that the people are the church, and the place that you meet is the meeting house. So they began to call the local meeting or the local church monthly meetings. And they did that because worship could occur any day or every day in some cases. They didn't necessarily only meet on first days or Sundays. They met anytime, anywhere. But they would meet once a month for business in that area. So it became monthly meetings. We have weird names for everything.
Yeah, we have a reason for those meetings.
Yeah.
But as they continued to spread, and they added other types of meetings. So meetings in London and Swarthmore and places like that, they couldn't all meet together all the time. They had their own things to do locally, but there were things that a region might have in common. So they formed, quarterly meetings, which were groups of near monthly meetings that were close together, would meet together for common business.
We now call those area.
Yeah, when I talk about area rally, that's what it is. It's
That's a quarterly meeting.
So we meet once a quarter. We don't really do a whole lot, but we meet once a quarter. And it's good to get in conversation with people outside your local meeting so that you can see what other people are experiencing. And then the yearly meetings, somehow I got those flipped around.
Don't know.
They're an annual gathering. Imagine that, yearly meeting. And it's either a nation or a region, a larger region. So an area would generally have like 5 or so meetings. Yearly meetings could have, our yearly meeting has like 68, something like that. So, and in 1902, they became more like a unified denomination. So before, if they're a yearly meeting, they did everything their own way. In 1902 is when they developed the unified discipline, and that's kind of when Friends became Friends Church instead of Religious Society of Friends.
I still like the first one better.
I do too.
Yeah.
I think most of our problems started when we started calling ourselves a church, because there was lots of freedom in just being a religious
To
society.
give you an idea, northeast area, which is what we're in, goes basically from not very far south of here to Fargo, North Dakota.
And we're northeast.
We're northeast.
But we're
There's
just
north
through the
central-
central part of the United States. We're Mid-America yearly meeting.
Right, our yearly meeting goes from Fargo to South Texas.
Yeah, Houston area. So
Yeah, there's several meetings, and some of our largest monthly meetings are in Texas.
That's so cool.
So anyone that attends can participate in a monthly meeting. If you worship, you can participate. If you just show up at the monthly meeting and that's the only thing that you show up to, you can still participate. And this remains true today, although for certain leadership roles, membership of some sort is required. And that's just things that have been added to the original thought process for security, for lack of a better word, but so that you know where people are coming from. So, what is a membership? Everybody needs to know this. If everybody can participate, why do you even need members? Members is to be called a member, you're expressing a testimony of cooperation with the meeting, saying, I like what you're doing, I want to be part of that, and you can count on me to participate in the ministry.
And like many things, Quaker is pretty anticlimactic.
Yep, I describe it like marriage. A lot of people will ask me about what membership is. You participate with somebody when you're dating. You're enjoying the company and that sort of thing. But you get to a point where you decide, this is the person I want to spend the rest of my life with, and you marry that person. That's what I like in membership too.
And
Is that how you proposed to Christy, Jared? Did you
Yes,
say,
I
would you
said,
remain
would
with
you
me?
like to become a member of my personal monthly meeting? I am a hopeless romantic. Yes.
I need a notepad.
An interesting note on this.
Pick up lines. Got it.
Yes.
The formal requirements for a Quaker wedding is at the end of a meeting, either for business or worship, the couple stands up and says, "We intend on being married." And the rest of the meeting goes, "Yeah, sure."
Wow.
And that is the requirement to be officially married
That is
in the Quaker church.
the extent.
All the rest of the stuff
It's just icing on the cake.
Wow.
So no
is
cooking
all
on
celebration
Easter.
and that sort of thing. But officially, that is the only thing that it needs. And while you do have to get a license now in the whatever county or state you're in, it doesn't mean that you have to have a big one. You could do that, get the license, do that in service, and then afterward, Jared and I, and maybe a couple other members of the meeting would sign the license.
Interesting. Wow.
Simply all that is required.
Technically, George Fox and Margaret Fell were never legally married because
Okay.
Quaker weddings weren't legal.
So do you do weddings here?
He's married my sister to her current husband.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, we conduct weddings because
Yeah.
we're ministers. It's just, I won't say by the power vested in me by the state of Missouri,
Right.
because state of Missouri doesn't have anything to do with it in my
Mhm.
in my thought process. So it might not be legal. I don't know. They haven't sent me a letter saying you owe us $500.
Could you still sign their form?
So,
Yeah.
but so there's different types of members. Participating member, according to Faith and Practice. Let's see if I can get Aubrey and them off of the screen for a little bit. Where's my mouse?
Right there.
So, participating member of the Friends Church is a person, adult, young adult, or advanced adolescent, who has made a credible profession of faith and who either on that profession or by certification from another Friends Church has been admitted to full membership of the church. Participating members are those who show an interest in the local church by giving it a major part of their attendance and support. Such members make the church what it is by their ready participation in its activities and services, their genuine interest in its objectives, and their faithful and loyal material support in tithes and offerings. Page 52 of the Faith and Practice. The one that's in here has the Swahili in it too. It's not exactly 52, but this is the official English version. So then there's non-participating members. Any guess on who they are? Participating members that no longer participate. They're still members. Because your profession of faith doesn't necessarily stop until you say that it stops. So they may not be actively participating in the ministry, and we label them non-participating if they haven't attended for a while. And a lot of non-participating members don't want their name removed from membership because, like, draft notices and stuff like that, they still want to be a member.
Yeah.
Even though they may not be able to attend. They might live in Minnesota or something. We had a non-participating member that lived in Minnesota, didn't she? Can't remember her name. Doesn't matter. But she wouldn't let us take her name off the membership roll.
We've
because
had several through the years that
she
have moved away. We have older members who have moved to live by where their kids now live, but they stay on as non-participating members.
So, and the only thing in faith and practice that they really point out is the elders of the meeting should do whatever they can to bring them back into participation.
They've never hounded anyone to participate. Actually, that's one of the reasons my wife and I left the church that we went through before, because they were very adamant about keeping track, even though it was a very large Missouri Synod Lutheran church. And we would miss a Sunday, and then Monday, sometimes Sunday afternoon, people would be calling us to know why we weren't at church.
That's trippy.
So, I don't do that either.
So that was this at one point, right?
Associate members are children born or adopted into homes of members. And I'm not going to read everything. But for an associate member to move into a participating member, they have to be like everybody else. They have to profess their faith. Yes.
What constitutes a profession?
That depends on, you can sign a form in the faith and practice and send it to the clerk. And we discuss it at a meeting for business. The meeting accepts you as members.
Okay.
So, or if you verbally like share an open worship regularly, that can, and profess your faith through that, that can be acceptable. Or a lot of what we've done in the past is, if you want to be a member, we'll ask you if you'd like to be a member. If you've been participating for a while, and we'll ask you questions about your faith. So
I do recall an interview process.
it's interview is, it's not official. What
you
you
don't
have
suddenly
to
get
do.
a pay raise or anything.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, you're then hounded to be to serve on a committee.
You can now serve. We allow my work for you to do.
There really isn't a process of membership. Each monthly meeting does it their own way. The reason they started interviewing here is because they started during the Vietnam War. A lot of people wanted to just become members.
Oh, sure.
Had nothing to do with Friends before that. They just wanted to have
The
their
exemption.
name on a membership roll so that they could say that they were conscientious objectors.
Yep.
So we'll accept you as a member, but you need to express something so that we can know if this is actually your true faith or if this is just you want to get out of something.
Yeah.
So I technically was not a member of the Friends Church until about 4 years after I became a pastor.
Wow.
And
You were a pastor in the Friends church?
In the Friends
And then-
Church.
okay.
Because nobody actually explained it.
Technically, you were an associate.
I was an
member.
associate member, technically, but I was 26. So
Yeah.
I should have been written off out of the minutes for 5 years at that point in time, but nobody explained it to me. So
You
that's
just renewed your
when
subscription.
did I become a
And
member?
if you grow up in the church,
Yeah.
it's just assumed you're still there. So
Which is kind of what I was.
you must
That's
agree.
cool. Like, I remember feeling like before I was baptized, you know, that you weren't allowed to take communion, you weren't allowed to do this. I just was kind of like, you know,
yeah.
felt excluded.
They used to call associate members birthright friends. So because you just grew up in the church, so you just automatically moved into it, leadership roles, which is basically how I acted. Then I read the Faith and Practice because I'm an elder, and I realized that
You're like, oh.
maybe if I'm going to be a recorded minister, I need to actually be a member. So
Yeah.
So yeah, I actually became an official member in Ark City Friends Church, and technically that church is no longer in existence. So my membership is.
I've never officially.
David,
He,
would
he,
you like
he,
to?
he could send me a letter.
Then it could be officially here. Okay. Yeah.
So
I could transfer his membership from the now closed church.
I'm telling you all this just to tell you how
Right.
it's important, but it's not.
We're not going to hit you with a ruler or anything if you don't do this.
It's very much, if you're going to help us, cool.
Yeah.
But don't expect us to put you in charge of something
Mm-hmm.
unless you're actually going to take steps that say that this is who I am, this is what I want to be. So, and then there's affiliate members, which is interesting. It's any other Christian that doesn't want to sever their ties with either their previous friend's church or another denomination, but they want to fully participate in our meeting.
We've had people, for example, that their parents were raised, or grandparents even, Catholic, and their grandparent was still alive and would be very upset if they found out that they had renounced
Sure,
the
yeah.
so they become affiliate members. It keeps the family happy. It doesn't really change anything in how things function.
So,
But it gets them out of some issues.
the children of affiliate members.
They're associate members.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a,
We're really digging in.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, it's a if you want them to be. It's all parental consent.
Interesting.
I can't put my son down as an associate member unless Christy and I both want him to be listed as an associate member. He is dedicated in the church, so yes, we gave that permission. Even though maybe I need to become an official member of the meeting. But Mark Rangel, our elder for Spiritual Life Committee, he's an affiliate member. He's a member of Liberal Friends Church. And the reason he's a member of Liberal Friends Church is his grandfather was a pastor of the Spanish-speaking branch of Liberal Friends Church. He is the founding minister. He didn't want to become a member here because his grandmother, who raised him, was still alive, and he still wanted to support that church. So we just always listed him as an affiliate member. They can still participate fully in everything. So, do you have to be a member?
Yes. No.
No.
You have to brand a Q into your forehead.
no one's going to force you to.
So, membership's a personal choice, and it's just a testimony saying, this is who I am, this is who I want to be with. Kind of like baptism. You profess your faith, you get baptized, you're a member of the church. Same thing, we just do it without water. We dry clean is how most people say.
And by the same token, we will never excommunicate you.
Unless you want to be written out of the meeting.
You can leave of your own accord, but we will never force you to leave.
Unless you request it.
Now, see, the reason I bring that up is personally, I have been excommunicated from 2 different denominations,
Impressive.
2 different varieties of Lutheranism in my
We make a
lifetime.
clerk.
Wow.
So, not all the people that attend here. This probably will surprise you. Probably not, since I already let the cat out of the bag. Not everybody that attends at Willow Creek are formal members, yet they do carry weight. My father-in-law is not a member, and he's here every single Sunday, unless he's at my son's hockey games.
And a lot of times during the week doing stuff.
And he is here 2 or 3 times a week, cleaning up, doing things at the meeting house. Nobody treats him as if he is a non-member. In fact, we didn't realize he wasn't a member until we actually looked. So, but when it comes time to fulfill leadership roles and that sort of thing, or if you want to take on leadership roles at a yearly meeting level, we do need to say, yes, they are a member. So, what are the leadership roles? Clerk,
Sorry.
recording clerk, committee elders, and pastor.
This is something that confuses people from other denominations. The pastor isn't at the top.
Oh.
Because if you're like Baptist, most mainstream denominations, the head of the church is the pastor.
Yeah.
They hire him to be like their CEO. We're different.
We're different. I'll get into it a little bit. So the monthly meetings, anybody and everybody that attends, participating, non-participating, associate, affiliates, and anyone else. Everybody can participate in the meeting. Then there's clerk and pastor, or ministers. And they carry weight, so a lot of people see them as leaders. And the other leadership roles, committee elders, recording clerk, treasurer, and then everybody else can serve on a committee. You can be on a committee, you can participate in the ministry of the church in some form, even if you aren't a member. We're just not going to make you the elder of that committee. But everybody in the monthly meeting is above, part of, and below. We're all together. It's a beautiful flow chart, isn't it?
I mean, and pretty much what he's put out there is ideally what happens. Now, if you were looking at non-program friends, there wouldn't be a pastor there.
Right.
Right. That's why I put or ministers, because there are ministers of other capacities. So
Legally, as far as a legal structure, I'm the one that we're a nonprofit corporation, so I can live, like when we did all the electrical work, I was the one who could sign the contract to do the work.
Yeah.
not me.
Yeah.
Thank God.
Yeah.
Now, many other denominations, it would have been the pastor making that decision and the pastor signing it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little confusing to people. It gets to be a grayer area as far as, I mean, there's a lot of Presbyterians, a lot of people don't realize there's multiple varieties of Presbyterian. Anyone know what Presbyterian stands for?
Is
Presbyter.
yeah, right.
The presbytery was the council of members. Ooh, does that sound awfully Quaker?
Well, aren't Presbyterians a peace church also? No.
No, that's Church of Scotland, so they're very much.
No. There are different ones. Like over there, you have what has become Church of Scotland,
Mm-hmm.
but you also have the non-covenanted Presbyterians. They didn't sign the covenants of governance. You find them both in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the Republic. They are still very much like Quakers, or the presbytery is essentially a monthly meeting.
Yeah.
And the non-covenanters still function that way, though they kind of heed grudging presence to the general Presbyterian Church. They're a subgroup,
Sure.
separate, like independent, but they don't have. They started out all as being non-covenant, independent churches, very similar to the way we function. As far as each church was independent, and then they imposed at a later date a hierarchy based on the Church of England of bishops and archbishops and stuff to organize themselves, and that was the whole covenant thing. When you had the unification of Scotland with England in 1704,
Something like that.
1702,
I
somewhere
can-
right
I
around
can
Say
there.
it with confidence, none of us are going to
King
call you
James,
out.
yeah.
1705.
So
Yeah.
it should be in your notes because
Yes.
we talked about it in our first meeting.
Yeah.
So-
Unification of England, Scotland.
So the leaders within the Friends Church come from within the Friends Church. So this meeting, all of the leaders in this meeting should be members of this meeting. And everyone's equal, but in some areas, certain members might carry more weight or influence. That doesn't mean that they're in charge of that necessarily. It just means that
We listen? No, that's not
it
the right
means
way.
that because of their activities or their passion, we listen to them more because they know what's going on. Kay is the elder over missions. We don't technically have a missions committee, but when anything that we want to talk about missions,
She's
we ask Kay
passionate about that.
because she's very interested in it and she knows. She takes the time to actually find out.
And those good with math are generally part of the audit committee? Or
Yeah. So,
something?
that's what it means by weight. So the clerk has weight in the meeting because of their gifts and their interests. Pastors obviously carry weight because of their giftedness, but certain other individuals, if I'm going to talk to anybody about how we should decorate something, I'm going to ask my wife. Not because she's a great decorator, but she's an artist, so she carries more weight in that area than I do. So
Those who care about it a lot and those
Yeah.
who have an actual background and training on it.
yeah.
I mean, basically, I look at my job as running meetings.
So obviously I know how to use PowerPoint. So the clerk, he's seen or she is seen as equal to the pastor. He has just as much, if not more, authority of this meeting than I do. So when you see clerks and pastors, the clerk in an unprogrammed meeting is usually the one that people are going to go to and ask questions to because they're seen as the leader of the meeting. So the clerk facilitates the meetings and they're the legal representative of the meeting. So if anything were to happen, I would say if the police needed to talk to somebody, I'd say you need to talk to the clerk. So if anything dealing with the business or the meeting itself, the clerk. If they're asking about spiritual beliefs or something like that, I'll answer that every day. But if it's actual something about this meeting, I pass it on to the clerk because
And I, in turn, bring it up to the monthly meeting.
yeah.
So we all
Unless
decide
it's something
on an
that needs to be
answer
decided
and we all agree
immediately.
on it.
And the clerk and the pastor are ex officio members of every committee.
Ideally, if the meeting is working right, and ours does, Jared and I talk a lot about what's going on in the meeting and in the yearly meeting because we're both elders in the yearly meeting as well. And that's how it should be. Where you run into problems is that the pastor's going this way and the meeting's going that way.
And
I
if
know-
it gets to that, then hopefully the pastor's wise enough to understand it and will stand aside and not get in the way of the meeting.
So
So
communication's kind of key.
yeah, committee elders are weighty friends in a certain aspect of the ministries of the meeting. Kay very much the most weighty friend when it comes to missions. Mark Rangel is the committee. Mark Rangel and Mark Fawcett are co-elders of the Spiritual Life Committee because they both are very interested in that. My wife and John Marcus are co-elders of the Stewards Committee because they're very concerned with making sure the building can take care of the ministry that we're asking it to perform. So, and David's very much part of that as well. Thank goodness, because I can't fix a thing. So we have 3 official committees that are always active: the Spiritual Life Stewards and Nominating Committee, and we'll go into those later. It doesn't really matter. And then the last of the leaders, non-pastoral leaders, are the treasurer. Just keeps track of all the finances, and they work closely with the stewards because the stewards spend the most money.
And then occasionally an audit committee gets activated to make sure the treasurer was doing
That one isn't required. We started that up a number of years ago because
We want to make sure
make sure that things are kept track of.
Yeah.
If you're curious, Sherry is the treasurer,
currently,
and the assistant treasurer is my wife, Vicky.
we try to put an assistant with almost everything at this meeting, just because if you can't make it, it's good to have another person that can do it. We have an assistant clerk too, so.
Yeah, his mother is the assistant clerk.
They've traded the position a couple times, so.
So if you noticed before, I put a question mark by the pastor. Pastors are weird.
Because demon kicking.
Initially, there weren't paid clergy in the Friends Church. Official, paid, this is your job sort of thing. And they spoke out against hireling ministers because you should be led by God, not by finances. He called them hirelings. If you want to insult a pastor, then in a Friends Church, you call him a hireling. Because you've left,
That's a new one. I haven't
you've
run
left
into
the
that one
church
before.
for financial reasons, and it's kind of it can be insulting.
I mean, to give you an idea, in England, up until relatively recently, and even in some cases still today, there are parishes within the Church of England that are controlled by a particular person or are handed out as a way of supporting. There are parishes that belong to the local member of the nobility that controls the land. They may control a parish within their lands. There may also be villages in there that it's controlled by the archbishop. But if you've ever read any Jane Austen novels,
Yes.
they talk about the guy is going to be the pastor, a position at this parish. In that case, there is some some member of the hierarchy is going, I own this parish.
Yes.
And I can put whoever I want in there and endow them with so much money a year to live on.
Yeah. That was the best example you could have used for me. Yeah.
Undoubtedly where the term hireling comes from.
Yeah.
Now, in Ireland, interestingly enough, in the early days, certain churches had hereditary pastors or hereditary priests.
Which is not unheard of. It's just
I mean, the original church that was in the area that is now Dublin was in the same family for like 500 years.
So
Wow.
when it comes to pastors, God ordains, not man. Man just records what God's already done. So that's where the term recorded minister comes from.
Or we're just acknowledging that, yeah, God said you're speaking His word.
So Friends didn't officially recognize recorded ministers until 1730. That's when England decided that they had to have an official person that can sign marriage documents. So they had to be recorded ministers. And basically when they started recording ministers, that's when the Friends Church in England started to decline to some degree. Because they got the idea that they were the ones that were in charge. So, paid Friends ministers were not widely accepted until 1892 and didn't officially become accepted until 1902 when the Unified Discipline came out.
Accepted by.
Friends in America.
We had a whole schism that took place.
Sure.
We'll get more into that later.
Yeah.
Schisms are great.
Yeah, there's a few schisms in Quaker history, and
But
reasons for are interesting.
I say that they weren't paid ministers weren't widely accepted, but there were people that were released for their calling, even among the Valiant 60, that were paid by any other explanation. They got their livelihood from the support of members of the church.
Very much the way modern missionaries
Yeah,
are.
they are. It's called released to their calling. So, and that's basically what they called paid pastors, because when they started doing paid ministers, the elders were the ones that had to do all the pastoral care, and so the clerk, the committee elders, and all that. Eventually, it was taking up a lot of time. So they released somebody that was gifted in that area to handle that education and that sort of thing, so that the elders could focus on other things. Very scriptural, because that's what the deacons did for the apostles as well.
The upstanding citizens.
So it's basically that's what they're doing. They're saying, we recognize that you're spending this amount of time away from work to make your own living, so we're going to reimburse you for that, so that you can do the ministry that you're called to do, clearly called to do. But again,
not
if
a
you want
hireling.
to insult a Friends pastor, you just start calling him a hireling, because you're just getting a job. You're just here for the money, right? So
It's so lucrative.
Yeah.
So again, Friends pastors are members of the meeting. We're not lifted up higher, we carry weight, but we're just a member of the meeting. And we carry weight because people recognize our calling. But all members are equal. But they're unique members, because we're one of the only people that are asked to be here. So you can call a minister to come to your church. So I wasn't a member of this church. They called me to be pastor of this church.
He had attended this church before.
I did attend this church before. Ideally, though, in a Friends church, your pastor should come from within the meeting. Ideally. Doesn't happen very much. But ideally, the meeting should be discipling somebody to take on that role. The church I grew up in, their pastor grew up in that church. And when most ministers are bivocational, it's important to call somebody that's established in the community already, because then they're not looking for a job. So that's the struggle with calling a minister to a meeting from outside, is they don't have that financial network going.
Right.
So I'm an odd case as well because my family went to this church. Christy's family's from this church, so kind of I'm called from within the meeting. So
This is side story. I have lots of side stories. We lost a pastor, and we were without a pastor for a year and a half,
something like that.
something like that. In that time, the services, the preaching, sermons, were done by a group of 3 or 4 of us. So during that time, they got lots of history lessons from me.
Partially why I know any of what I've said. Thanks
but,
to him
and
others.
we've been not had, so we kind of took a leap and did something very unconventional. We called Jared and we called John Harkness. John at that time was he at Berkeley?
He just graduated.
He just graduated from Berkeley. He had been here like as a intern, so we knew him from that, and so we called both of them at the same time, and that lasted
A year.
about a year. And John's wife was from Haviland.
Middle of nowhere.
She could not deal with Kansas City.
Yeah.
And
They're still definitely welcome here, but
oh yeah. I mean, I always enjoy
No
meeting
question.
them at yearly meetings and stuff like that. So after a year, John resigned, and Jared stayed.
we're grateful for that.
And I think a big part of that has to do is that he does have, let's say, Christy's family. You were commenting the other day about needing
I do.
a flow chart.
Flow chart for family trees
To
and
understand
connections.
who's related to who.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
Luckily, you got married to somebody before you actively found somebody here,
That's a good
because you
point.
kind of have to ask before you marry somebody, because a lot of us are related. So
Yes.
my pastor growing up, his wife really wanted me to date one of her daughters, and I said ew, and she was offended. She's like, "Why did you say that?" I'm like, "It's my cousin."
Yeah.
Oh yeah, because they moved to Kansas from Oregon, so she
Forgot that
didn't
Yeah.
remember who
Was
all
related
in Kansas
to.
was related.
and
But
Jared's much better at navigating the web of when you
I'm-
take into the whole yearly meeting.
Oh.
It
I'm
is a
really
nightmare
not
of
part of
who's
that.
related to who
Yes.
in the web of
It's
yearly meeting.
very-
I'm really not part of that web at this point.
you aren't. You're one of the few that aren't. My wife isn't either.
I'd like to change
They're
part of that somewhere.
she's no, she would technically not be a birthright Quaker because she was born before she became a Quaker, before her family did. But anyway, we lead the meeting, but not like other denominations, because our leadership is usually more of encouraging other people to do what most denominations would see as pastoral work, which is kind of interesting, which every pastor in the Friends Church struggles with. What am I actually doing here? Am I just preaching, or what am I doing? And it really is a struggle, because you are just a member. You don't control. You have to submit to everybody else. And why are you paying me just to come up and preach every morning? But we also do other things. So, but each pastor is different with what they do. So there are actual pastors that don't preach. All they do is visitation.
Yeah.
And they might help organize meetings for worship, but they don't preach.
I mean, it is entirely conceivable and there's no rule to prevent it. Like I said, when we didn't have a pastor, we took turns. When Jared's gone, and fortunately now we have Bill and Gotti and Mutanda who preach, and we think that's really good for it. Occasionally I have stepped in, Mark Randall has stepped in, we've had others in the past, but there's nothing to say that if God lays on your heart that you have a message that you think the meeting should hear, talk to Jared and I, and we'll put you in the schedule if you want to get up and preach.
Yeah, I'm one of the first to say, yeah, go ahead. What do you need what resources do you need so I can help you do your best? So.
And I have occasionally in the past told Jared, I have some stuff I want to talk about. And he's never told me, no, I can't do that. So neither one of us would tell you that.
Maybe I should transition back to what we're doing here instead of
Side story? Okay.
So
Definitely
I have a video of an interview with a Friends pastor that I thought was good. So we'll close with that. My part of the presentation anyway. Maybe.
Quakers believe that each person has a ministry, has a call, has something that the Spirit is calling them to do. And because of that, we believe that each of us has gifts and that we each have a role in our meeting community. So we each minister to each other within a Quaker community. So I'm one of many ministers, which is why I'm called a pastoral minister. I'm Margaret Webb. I'm the pastoral minister at New Garden Friends meeting in Greensboro, North Carolina. I grew up in an unprogrammed meeting, and we loved one another and we cared for one another. But I do think that it's useful to have one person who is paid, released, to do that work, to tend to those connections, and to also help alert the wider community to needs. Some pastors take deep joy in worship planning and reading spiritual works and preparing their hearts and their minds for worship, and that's the center of their ministry. And some pastors find their center in religious education and in helping people learn about faith and explore faith. For me, the center of my ministry is really pastoral care. So I start there with my week, and then I build outwards from there. So a lot of what I do during the week is visit people. I visit elderly people who maybe can't make it to meeting every Sunday or who can't come to meeting at all anymore. And I visit people who are sick, and I visit people who have been hospitalized, and I visit people who are in crisis. And I provide a presence with those people. So a lot of the work that I do as a pastoral minister is helping be with people who need somebody to be with them. I put together pieces for meeting for worship. So if we have music as part of our worship, I help with the selection of music, and I prepare a message, which is usually quite short, that helps deepen our silence. And then I also often prepare other pieces of programming as needed. So baby dedications or vow renewals. If a couple wants to renew their vows, I'll prepare those pieces as well. Business gets done in Quaker meetings by committee. And that has been my experience in unprogrammed silent meetings, and also in programmed meetings where there's a pastor who helps with worship. Still, all of the work of the meeting is done by committees. So my role as pastoral minister is to just support that work, to provide whatever kinds of tools those committees might need to do the work that they're doing for the meeting. So I can't do all of the pastoral care of the meeting. That would be impossible. But we have committees that also help with that care. It's my role to be intentional about people's needs. And that also people who have gifts of pastoral care, which there are a number of people in this meeting who have those gifts, that they're being connected to people who need the nurture. So I'm the person who makes connections a lot of times. I'm also, in some ways, like a gardener. I provide the space of nurture when it's needed, and also empower other people to step into that gardener role. And I think some communities do best when they have someone who has been released to be their gardener. That's one of the ways that communities have found a way to thrive in the modern world.
So,
Oh,
actually,
that's Naylor right there.
Mm.
On
yeah,
the far
that's James
Oh.
Naylor. Can you see why some people in England might have considered him to be Jesus?
Yeah.
So, that's also a painting of Witch Trial, which if you listen or if you read Anne Fisher and Mary Fisher and Anne's account of what happened during that witch trial, it's very detailed, and they were stripped, and men and women just looked all over their bodies to see if they had marks of witch. So
Not a fun
it's interesting
prospect.
as I put all the slides together before I found the video, and pretty much everything that I said is exactly what she said, and we come from two totally different
Yeah.
traditions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of funny.
Yeah.
So any questions about what was presented today?
They're just going, why did David talk so much and keep us here so late?
Nope, you're fine, David. When it comes to this presentation, I don't mind you being here because you know the history a lot better than I do. And like I said, each of those people that I talked about are at least one complete session on each of them would be not enough time.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next generation is just as much. William Penn and Robert Barclay, Daniel Wheeler, who actually went to St. Petersburg, Russia, and dug their canals, and then got kicked out because he acted too much like a Jesuit.
Interesting.
So, I mean, they all have very interesting stories, but we don't publish near as much as we used to because most of our ministers are now pastors.
Mm.
So they write sermons instead of pamphlets and books. So it's mine are all published on my blog, so you are more than welcome to read them again. I know when I've stepped on toes because the readership goes way up. And when I see that, I call David, you might have a problem.
he does that every once in a while. He says, I just published, he mails it to me and goes, you might want to read this so you know if you start getting emails what they're talking about.
So, but yeah, it is, they're all very interesting people, and even though Evangelical Friends don't look exactly like they did back then, our roots are definitely the same.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of what we believe are definitely the same. We just express it a little bit differently. And a lot of the people that faced persecution, a lot of it was meaningless. So, yeah, the blasphemy, I can understand that, but most of the time they went to jail for not taking off their hat,
Calling you the
not
yeah.
expressing.
refusing to pay the required tithe to the Church of England.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah, that was
That'll do
they
it.
got in trouble for a lot.
So they weren't allowed to go to school. So a lot of them were involved in arguing these cases in front of a court, but they weren't educated as barristers or whatever they're called.
Not legally educated, even if they were very
So-
smart and
Right.
well informed.
Yeah.
But they lived every aspect of their life according to their faith. And that's the main thing from it is if I say that I believe something, I better live it out. Because there's nothing else in Friends that can express it than how I interact with people around me. I can't go into the steeple house, as they call them. There's a reason Friends churches traditionally don't have steeples, is because it's kind of like hireling. If you go to a steeple house, then you're not simple enough because your building has a steeple. But ours doesn't. We took our steeple off.
We had one at one time. When I first started coming here, there was a little cupola up there. It wasn't really a steeple.
That's cool.
And it did have a cross on top of it.
But you couldn't just go there and take communion and say, "Hey, I'm a great Christian person because I did this." You had to actually live it out. And that's why they were so successful in business, was because they lived their faith even in their business techniques.
Which that gets into some other historical lessons.
Yeah, in fact, one of the biggest arguments for the Tolerance Act was we need to let the Quakers
Conduct business.
stop persecuting them because they're going to take over our country financially.
Wow.
Because they were extremely good business people, both
Like,
the men and women.
like actual price tags as opposed to haggling. And if
Yeah.
you caught someone who didn't like you, you were out of luck on getting stuff.
A lot of what we take for granted, especially in the United States, comes directly from Friends.
Wow.
So the Constitution, although it was mostly from Virginia or something like that, most of it comes from William Penn. So,
Yeah.
because not the slavery part and the 2/5 or whatever,
No, that wasn't
my
and
question.
all that, but a lot of how we interact as government here in the United States comes from a lot of Friends' beliefs.
Interesting.
Why major changes require 2/3 instead of a simple majority is because you need more than just a majority.
Otherwise, it's mob rule.
That was
Yeah.
what Friends added. They compromised with the voting part, but that's because Pennsylvania couldn't do anything.
First week, since I wasn't here, I was teaching then. Did you go over the difference between programmed and unprogrammed?
Not really. I just did history of George Fox and what happened before
Are
Friends.
you planning on doing that, or should I keep my mouth shut?
We will, because
Okay.
I think the next time I'll talk about the schisms in the United States.
Oh, those are fun.
So, England basically did not have any of the schisms that we had. They are pretty much
There's
the
no-
same as they were back then.
There's no equivalent of Evangelical Friends really in England,
So,
and the only ones in Ireland are missionaries.
so,
Wow.
yeah, they are. Most of the schisms are here, and there's reasons for it, and good reasons, and bad reasons, and
Reasons worth arguing over.
and reasons that we should learn from.
Yeah.
So, and
Should we be in war? Should we call Jesus Lord? Stuff like that.
but and part of them
Some of those were
go back
repeats.
to conversations like between Nader and Fox.
That's really interesting.
So it's very interesting. But
And
we
we
have
even
a
have our
rich
little
history.
own local schisms.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I'm sure.
In Emporia, there was First Friends of Emporia, and there's Cottonwood, and then there used to be a third. And
They call third. Nobody ever calls themselves second.
The
What
second.
they actually did call
Are they called
the other one they called Second Friends.
I've always wanted to be part of a church that was like Second Baptist or Third United Methodist.
Yeah.
I feel like, you know what I mean? Just it'd be different.
I am
Just like,
so much with you on that. So, because I think it's just funny.
Who was it that the car company that had the Avis? Hertz was the largest car rental company in the 60s, 70s. Avis came out. We're number 2. We try harder. Answer to Hertz that we're number 1.
Yeah. We're slightly just as good.
You've tried the best, now try the rest. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
So, anyway, next week we will do chapter 2 in the book. And you can't see it, but it says chapter 2. The title of the chapter is Turning Outside In, or Turned Outside In, Spiritual Silence for Saints and the Rest of Us. And then week 7, Looking for Answers Together. I just copied last time I did this and continued. You can't see it, but the same typo is there that was there last time. And then week 8 again will be practicing silence together. So, but if you have questions for answering questions or finding answers together, let me know. I'm gonna put universal salvation or sanctification on there because it was brought up a couple weeks ago. If you have something else, that's cool too. So, anyway, thanks for coming.
no, thank you.
Thanks for coming.
I'm glad I bored you.
I do have a question about that year where we were having people standing because and I seem to recall something bad happening with Pastor between John and Jared here and Gary.
See you later, Eric.
We had another
Bye.
Yes,
that was what
Bye, guys.
caused it,
Thank you.
I'm guessing.
that was one of our schisms, yes.
And before that, it
The problem is we had an earlier set of clerks and elders that were around when I first got here, none of which